also want what I also want to say to everyone is this is a process, right? So, as much as I have some ideas and some strategies, getting coaches on board mental health and wellness services is definitely a process. And so really more than anything tonight, I'm going to talk about a process, but I hope to embed a few strategies. And like I said, on Eastern Standard Time, it's about 7:09. So I'm only going to talk for about 10 minutes as I'm sharing this piece. All right. So there's some things I want to talk about. I want to talk about continuum. I want to talk about core content. I want to talk about behavioral health pros. I want to talk about allies, infrastructure, and close. And yes, I am going to talk about that in now 9 minutes. And the reason that I think that these things are important is one, I always think that we have to remind coaches, high school, college coaches, that mental health exists on a continuum, right? When coaches usually think about mental health, they think about, so-and-so's got a disorder, or they so-and-so, using substances, or so-and-so is experiencing trauma. But in order to truly get them on board, to build a bridge from where they are to where we want them to be, we need to help them understand that there's a continuum. And actually, when we talk about those coaches who just want to win, 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 sometimes frequently discuss the high functioning end, because sometimes those are going to be the players that say, oh, you know what, they're just, if their mindset was better, then they could play better. Good. You're sort of reeling them in. And then you start to talk about those who are stressed, but they're coping. And then moving down the line to anxiety and struggling and disorders and unwell. That way we help them to understand that there is a continuum to mental health. And therefore more of their athletes, male or female, regardless of ethnicity and race, could utilize some level of service that you're providing. All right. Whether it's intense CBT, DBT, or whether it's simply, using a relaxation or meditation technique. Okay. The next thing I think is important, and as I'm saying these things, what I hope that you see, the way that I'm going is that you have to build a vision. You have to build a vision around coaches. Coaches, like, and Dr. Gill is a coach, and some of you others may coach, but you try and build a system, a culture, a vision for what you're trying to do. And the same thing is important as you're developing a mental health piece. And so this core content that I'm looking at here was something that I had to figure out when I was at North Carolina Central University in Durham, North Carolina, because one of the things that the AD would say, well, Emmett, that's too much. It's too much. What we really got to get a playbook. And when she said playbook, I said, yeah, I got you. A playbook. Our core issues that we're going to try and deal with. Understanding that we can't deal with everything, but giving them, a more specific picture of exactly what I was going to deal with, what the graduate students were going to deal with. And it provided a great opportunity to have a conversation with coaches, because I had to essentially do somewhat of a needs assessment. So I had to sit down and talk to them about, so what's going on in your team with regard to substance use. Let's talk about the kids who had come from trauma. And when I say trauma, I wasn't talking to the head coach or assistant coach. I was talking to the director of recruiting. Okay. So the one thing that you also want to do is get in when you can fit in. You don't necessarily have to talk to the head coach all the time. Sometimes talking to the executive assistant for the head coach is just as good as talking to the head coach. And so a lot of this, as we're trying to figure out how to get coaches on board, is really figuring out the entry points, right? So we're looking at mental health on a continuum, and we're trying to help them to understand that and see that more players are eligible for our service. Second of all, through interaction with the coaches, we're trying to develop a playbook. All right, what are your core issues? What are your core issues? And in their core issues is going to come the issue of performance. But you need to keep bringing them back and reeling them back into how that can be related to mental health, and just outside of, visualization, focus, and positive thinking. Now, this part I think is really important. It's important to me because I'm a social worker, but it's just become more important to me regardless of being a mental health practitioner. And it's a little bit of education, right? It's a little bit of education. Because most coaches think, well, if you're a sports psychologist, then you work with athletes, you're specifically meant to work with athletes, and it's a mental health piece in terms of non-performance issues. But we know that sports psychologists are diverse and very talented. So they do clinical psychology, they do educational psychology, they do counseling psychology, and they do sports psychology. And many of them have dual titles. Being able to find unique ways to share that with coaches is the way to go. What would I do? Well, when I was at one of the schools that I work with, I'd invite colleagues over of different disciplines. And it would just so happen that I would meet the same coach each time that I was working on, the same one. So he or she would meet the sports psychologist, the LPC, the psychiatrist, and the social worker. Now, I might not introduce them to all, right? Because I don't know many psychiatrists, but I try and get 3 in. And ultimately, I would get the question, you call them different things. Or what does that person do that's different from that person? Oh, that's a great question. Well, let me explain it to you. And so they understand that, one, mental health comes in different packages in terms of how we deliver it. 2, you're sort of educating them with regard to what is going to be their playbook. And 3, you've got them looking at a continuum of mental health. Now, if you have a coach who is engaged to that point, and one thing is, you're not going to engage all the coaches at one time. It's not going to happen. You're not going to engage field hockey, baseball, swimming, soccer. You're not. What you're going to look for is what we call the influencer, the 1 or 2 influencers. When we talk about Power 5 conference sports, typically that's football, basketball, men's or women's basketball. But sometimes it's soccer. Sometimes it's women's soccer. Sometimes it's volleyball. And once you sort of target 1, 2, or 3 coaches, and if 1 or 2 of them are influencers, now you're rolling. Getting them on board is a process. So I put this up in front of you because once I started to reel in a couple of coaches, we decided, you know what? Everything can't be face-to-face. Everything that I mentioned to you is pretty much face-to-face. And if you're going to try and get them on board, you got to go face-to-face. You know how it is. If you're in high school athletics, you got to be there during the school day. You got to be there after practice. You got to be there at the booster events. You got to be there at the parent events. You got to be there. You got to be having these conversations. If you're in college athletics, well, you got to be at practice. You got to be at the training table. You got to be at the SAC stuff. You got to be at the academic support awards. You got to be at all that. You got to be talking mental health. As a matter of fact, I got to the point where I would go to thrift stores and find T-shirts that had mental health messages on them. And they knew what I had on when I was coming. I'm trying to use everything that I've got, right? So we would do newsletter, a fall volume and a spring volume. That's it. Not email, hard copy. Once we had a graphic artist, we tried to make it look as close to something athletic, like the play calling things that they had on their wrist, something that has a sports thing. And this is very important. Hard copy, something that they have to read, something that they need to read, multiple copies for all of their staff. And that was probably one of the most effective tools that we had once we were reeling coaches. So you've got to have some ways to educate when you don't have face-to-face time with them. The other thing that I'll say about face-to-face time, as you get more comfortable with coaches, is asking them this sort of big picture question. What's been your experience with mental health? What's been your experience with mental health? And the reason that I would ask that question is because it would give me some idea of what their level of commitment might be, especially if they had a mental health trend disorder that trended in their family because of, biology, like a bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, substance abuse. If they had some experience with it, then I had another way of approaching them because they understand it. Now, whether they're going to deal with it with their athletes is one thing, but they definitely understand it. So what is it that I could do with that? I could do a lot of different things with it. I could bring them in and have them talk to our graduate students. I could invite them in some conversations to educate, our staff and share from their perspective, right? On the other hand, I could really see afterwards where their level of commitment was. Sometimes when I would talk to coaches about their experience in mental health, they would come back and talk to me again, something that they thought about afterwards. Some would come and ask me why I do what I do, what my experience was mental health with. And so the other piece is, if you're going to get them on board, it can't be just, the black and white of mental health. It also, you have to make a commitment. And sometimes that commitment requires some self-disclosure about why you got in the business, what your philosophy is, what your experience is with mental health. One thing coaches want, they want authenticity. They definitely want authenticity. Authenticity is oftentimes, for me, the difference between me getting them in the door or getting them on board and not getting them on board. Coaches like systems. Coaches like vision. Coaches like to feel, whether they're in high school, they feel like they're building a college system. If they're in college, they want to feel like they're building a pro system. They want to know what resources they have. This is something that you're doing to get them on board when they're not around. I'm talking to sports medicine, if that's not where I'm embedded. I'm talking to academic support. If I'm in high school, I'm talking to teachers. If I'm in high school, I'm talking to the one trainer that you probably have for everybody, right? If I'm in college, I'm talking to SAC. Typically, there is some type of high school group where the athletes are a part of, possibly. And then you're talking to administrators. And what this is about is trying to see who are your allies. Who are your allies, especially if it was senior administrators. Because if it's senior administrators, then you have an opportunity to say, you know what, these are some of the things that I've done. These are some things that I want to do. Here's an opportunity for you to share, see where they are, and possibly ask them and do some of the same things with them that you were doing with the coaches. Because at the end of the day, you can be a champion, but every champion needs a supporting cast. And like I said, coaches need to see the larger vision. When you talk to a coach about mental health, they see a player, probably one or two, and they think they can save them. And they don't really see the larger picture of changing the culture. And that's the word that I would use, culture. We want to change the mental health of your team so we can help enhance the culture. They love that word, culture. And to do that cultural change, you have to be saying some of the same things and figuring out who are the allies. So when I go to talk to an athletic department about athlete talk, I'm looking at their entire staff directory and I'm clicking on it to see how many people have a counseling degree, how many people have a social work degree, how many people have children. Because ultimately, you're trying to build a relationship. And to build a relationship, you have to know about the people who you're trying to build a relationship with. And then the last thing is sort of putting this all together, their vision for mental health. What are their expectations? You have to try as much as you can to get them to share their expectations with you, because then you're going to be looking good because you're trying to make their expectations come true. And if you can relate it to wins and losses, that's even better, right? I mean, if we look at some of the top programs right now, those are programs that have robust mental health efforts. Policies, not so much, but sustainability is important. Coaches like numbers. Coaches like metrics. So I would substitute policies for something that I would call not just quantitative outcomes, but qualitative outcomes. And I wouldn't call them that. I call them results. Like I would talk results with football coaches. And I know that's not typical for us in the mental health field because we're sort of engineers of people. We work with minds and people, and it's no exact science to it. but you also have to get into that coach speak, right? You got to talk about their language. Like one coach, he got my attention because he said aces one time. I was like, what you know about aces? You talking about cars? He was like, no, adverse childhood experience. I'm like, oh my man. So you got to be able to talk their language. Whatever your infrastructure for them looks like, the point is that you definitely want them to have a vision for your system. And then this anxiety reduction lab that I'm showing, actually that was the result of 3 different departments who came on board, who all came together because all of the coaches that they were dealing with, I think it was like, not all, but it was like 3, were all talking about how do we reduce anxiety? And they were all talking about meditation. So we built the anxiety reduction lab where athletes had an opportunity to practice mindfulness and meditation and yoga. So really to close, it's going to be challenged. Getting coaches on board is no joke, but target the influencers. Take time. You got to take time. It's a reciprocal process. You're going to get information. You're going to give information. You're going to educate. You're going to listen. You're going to talk about things like building the culture. It takes time. It's going to be frustrating, especially in season. It's going to be frustrating in season. But life is all about getting through different seasons, right? So you just got to get to the off season. And you also have to look at different seasons that come about in college sports, right? Pay attention to, things like Lane Johnson was on Fox Sports yesterday talking about his mental health struggles for almost 4 or 5 minutes. Use that. But at the end of the day, it's going to be successful. You are going to move the meter. Now, you may not move the meter all the way across the gauge, but you're going to move the meter. And really what I think that we as practitioners need to continue to do is think about things like an infrastructure, culture building, and trying to understand that this is a long-term approach. We still have to be as vigorous in working for, the athletes who are going to come 2 or 3 years down the line as we do the athletes in front of us, right? You got to still think long-term. So those are some of the things that I really wanted to share. I went over a little bit, my apologies. But again, my goal tonight is 1, providing the space, and 2, just giving some food for thought. Like you might be like, Emmett, one of them slides that you had, I might be able to do a little something with. That's good. I wish that I had, some specific, sort of tricks and things like that. But I think that those things come from us understanding getting coaches on board is synonymous with building a relationship with them, right? And so we're just building a relationship around our mutual interest of the well-being of athletes. That's ultimately the way that I see it from my perspective. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen now and, just love